For decades, the world has been haunted by questions that seemed impossible to answer. Dark secrets buried beneath layers of time, forgotten truths locked away in dusty archives, and mysteries that made us question everything we thought we knew about our favorite stars and the golden age of entertainment. But what happens when the silence finally breaks? What happens when the truth, no matter how shocking, finally comes to light? Today, we're diving into the shadows of Hollywood's past to uncover the mysteries that have finally been solved. Revelations so profound they'll change how you see the glittering facade of Tinseltown forever. The night Marilyn Monroe's secret twin disappeared. The year was 1962, and Hollywood was about to lose its most luminous star. But little did the world know, Marilyn Monroe wasn't alone in her final months. Deep within the classified files of a private investigator's estate, discovered only in 2019, lay photographs and testimonies that would shake the very foundation of everything we believed about that tragic August night. According to these newly uncovered documents, Marilyn had been secretly working with her alleged half-sister, Norma Jean Baker, a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to the star, and had been living in obscurity in a small California town. The files suggest that this mysterious woman had been serving as Marilyn's double for public appearances during the actress's most troubled periods, when her battles with addiction and depression made her unreliable for studio obligations. The night of August 4, 1962, wasn't just the night Marilyn died, it was the night her double vanished without a trace. Witnesses reported seeing two identical women in the vicinity of Marilyn's Brentwood home that evening. But for 60 years, no one could explain this impossible sighting. The truth, finally revealed through these documents, suggests a conspiracy so intricate that it involves studio executives, government officials, and even members of organized crime. The double, according to the files, had been living under the name Mary Jean Williams and working as a seamstress in Bakersfield. She had been discovered by a talent scout in 1959, not for her acting ability, but for her shocking resemblance to Monroe. The studio system, already struggling to manage Marilyn's erratic behavior, saw an opportunity. They began using Mary Jean for long-distance shots, publicity photos, and even some close-up scenes in Marilyn's final films. But something went terribly wrong that August night. The files suggest that Mary Jean had grown tired of living in Marilyn's shadow and had begun making demands, threatening to expose the elaborate deception unless she received proper compensation and recognition. The last entry in the investigator's notes, dated August 5, 1962, simply reads, "Subject MJW has disappeared. All traces eliminated. Case closed by order of studio head." What happened to Marilyn Monroe's secret double remains one of Hollywood's most chilling mysteries. But now we know she existed, and her disappearance may hold the key to understanding what really happened during those final tragic hours of cinema's greatest icon, The Conqueror. When Hollywood ignored atomic warning signs in the dusty desert of Utah, 137 miles downwind from nuclear test sites, a film was being made that would become one of Hollywood's most infamous productions. The Conqueror, starring John Wayne as Genghis Khan, seemed doomed from its conception in 1954. But the true horror of this film wouldn't be revealed for decades until government documents were declassified. In 2019, finally, solving a mystery that had haunted Hollywood insiders for over 60 years, the film's producer, Dick Powell, had chosen the Utah location, specifically because the dramatic landscape would provide the perfect backdrop for the epic story. What he didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that the Atomic Energy Commission had been conducting above-ground NUCLEAR tests just miles away. The Upshot Knothole series of atomic bomb tests had contaminated the entire region with radioactive fallout, turning the seemingly pristine desert into a toxic wasteland. For 3 months, 220 cast and crew members worked in this contaminated environment, breathing radioactive dust, drinking contaminated water, and sleeping under skies still thick with atomic particles. The declassified documents reveal that government officials were aware of the danger but chose to remain silent, afraid that publicity would damage America's nuclear testing program during the height of the Cold War. The curse began to manifest itself almost immediately. Within 2 decades of the film's completion, 91 of the 220 people who worked on The Conqueror had developed cancer. John Wayne died of stomach cancer in 1979. Susan Hayward succumbed to brain cancer in 1975. Director Dick Powell died of lymphatic cancer in 1963. Just 9 years after completion of the film, the newly declassified Atomic Energy Commission memos paint a chilling picture of bureaucratic callousness. One document, dated March 1954, reads, "Film production in Area 7 poses minimal risk to national security interests. Recommend no disclosure of contamination levels to civilian personnel." Another memo suggests that the commission was actually curious to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure on a controlled group of subjects. Agnes Moorehead, who played John Wayne's mother in the film, became one of the most vocal advocates for the affected cast and crew before her own death from uterine cancer in 1974. Her personal journals, discovered in her estate in 2021, reveal her growing suspicion about the connection between the film and the wave of cancers affecting her colleagues. In one heartbreaking entry, she wrote, "We were lambs led to slaughter, and the shepherds knew exactly what they were doing." The most damning evidence came from a whistleblower within the Atomic Energy Commission who, on his deathbed in 2018, confessed to a documentary filmmaker that the government had deliberately chosen not to warn the film crew because they wanted to study the effects of low-level radiation exposure on a large group of people. His testimony, corroborated by the declassified documents, finally solved the mystery of why so many people associated with the Conqueror had died of cancer. This wasn't just a tragic coincidence, it was a calculated sacrifice of human lives for the advancement of atomic science. Hidden beneath the glamorous facade of Hollywood filmmaking, how MGM covered up Hollywood's first serial killer deep within the basement archives of what was once Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios. A security guard's logbook from 1947 contained entries that would chill the blood of anyone who read them. For 75 years, these pages remained sealed, classified as company confidential by a studio system that would do anything to protect its image. But in 2022, when MGM's old Culver City lot was finally demolished, construction workers uncovered a hidden room, and within it, evidence of Hollywood's darkest secret. The studio system had knowingly harbored and protected a serial killer. The killer's name was Thomas Earl Morrison, and he had been working as a talent scout for MGM since 1945. His job was simple: find beautiful young women who dreamed of stardom and bring them to Hollywood for screen tests. What the studio executives knew, but chose to ignore, was that many of these hopeful starlets were never seen again after their meetings with Morrison. The security logbook reveals a pattern of deliberate negligence that borders on complicity. Entry after entry documents young women arriving at the studio for appointments with Morrison, but there are no corresponding exit records. When families began filing missing person reports, the studio's response was swift and brutal. They hired private detectives not to find the missing women, but to discredit the families making the claims. Morrison's method was sophisticated and protected by the studio's vast resources. He would target young women from out of state, particularly those from poor families who had traveled to Hollywood alone. He would wine and dine them, promise them screen tests, and then lure them to remote locations under the pretense of outdoor photography sessions. The studio provided him with cars, fake identification, and most chilling of all, a network of contacts who would dispose of evidence. The breakthrough in this decades-old mystery came from an unexpected source: Morrison's own confession, discovered in 2021 among the personal effects of a Catholic priest who had died during the COVID-19 pandemic. Father Miguel Santos had been Morrison's confessor during the killer's final years in a nursing home, where he had died in 1998. The confession, written in Morrison's own hand and dated 1996, detailed the murders of at least 17 young women between 1945 and 1951, but perhaps the most shocking revelation was the studio's level of involvement. Morrison's confession reveals that studio head Louis B. Mayer himself had been aware of the killings and had made a calculated decision to protect Morrison because he was bringing in valuable talent for the studio's other legitimate discoveries. The confession states, "Mr. Mayer told me that as long as I kept bringing in the beautiful ones who could make the studio money, he didn't care what happened to the ones who couldn't act." The studio system's machinery of silence was so effective that even when Morrison was finally arrested in 1951 on an unrelated charge, MGM's lawyers managed to have the case dismissed and all records sealed. Morrison was quietly transferred to the studio's New York office, where he continued working until his retirement in 1975. The families of Morrison's victims never received justice, never even learned the truth about what happened to their daughters and sisters. They died believing their loved ones had simply disappeared into the vastness of Hollywood's broken dreams, never knowing that they had encountered a monster protected by one of the most powerful institutions in America. The Twilight Zone episode. That was never supposed to air. Odd. Serling was known for pushing boundaries, for using science fiction as a mirror to reflect society's darkest truths. But there was one episode of The Twilight Zone that went too far. An episode that accidentally predicted a real tragedy and revealed government secrets that weren't supposed to be public knowledge for another 50 years. The episode was called The Silent Observers, and for 60 years, only 5 copies were known to exist, locked away in CBS vaults under the highest security classification. In 2021, a former CBS executive's estate sale included a single reel of 16mm film, unmarked, and forgotten in a box of old television memorabilia. When film preservationists examined the reel, they discovered they had found the legendary lost episode, and with it, the solution to one of television's most enduring mysteries. The Silent Observers aired once, on November 15, 1963, just 7 days before President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. The episode told the story of a small town where mysterious government agents were conducting secret experiments on unsuspecting citizens, using television broadcasts to test the effects of subliminal messaging on large populations. The twist ending revealed that the experiments were being conducted not by foreign enemies, but by the American government itself, preparing to control public opinion during a national crisis. The episode was immediately pulled from circulation and never CBS claimed it was due to technical difficulties, but internal memos discovered with the film reel revealed the truth. The episode had accurately described a real CIA program called MKUltra, specifically the sub-project focused on mass media manipulation. The coincidence was so precise that government officials suspected Serling had somehow gained access to classified information. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is that Serling's script, found alongside the film reel, contains handwritten notes that suggest he based the episode on conversations with a mysterious informant he called only Deep Background. These notes, written in Serling's distinctive handwriting, describe meetings in darkened parking garages and coded telephone calls, all classic hallmarks of intelligence community whistleblowing. The informant had revealed to Serling that the government was indeed using television broadcasts to test subliminal messaging techniques, and that a major demonstration of these techniques was planned for a significant national event in the near future. Serling, always the storyteller, had crafted these revelations into what he thought was a work of fiction, not realizing he was documenting a real conspiracy. When President Kennedy was assassinated just days after the episode aired, government officials became convinced that Serling's informant had leaked information about a plot to use television coverage of the assassination to test mass psychological manipulation techniques on the American public. The episode was immediately classified, and all copies were ordered destroyed, except for the 5 that were secretly preserved by CBS executives who understood the historical significance of what they had witnessed. The rediscovered episode reveals Serling at his most prophetic and most dangerous. In the climactic scene, the main character realizes that the entire nation is being used as a laboratory for mind control experiments, and that the greatest tragedy isn't the manipulation itself, but the fact that most people would willingly accept it as long as it made them feel safe. The episode ends with the chilling line, "The observers have become the observed, and the watched have become the watchers. Welcome to the twilight zone of American democracy." This lost episode finally solved the mystery of why Rod Serling became increasingly reclusive and paranoid in his later years, why he seemed to lose his edge as a social commentator, and why he repeatedly claimed that his greatest work would never see the light of day. He had glimpsed behind the curtain of American power and realized that sometimes the truth really is too dangerous for primetime television. James Dean's final secret, the crash that changed everything. September 30, 1955. The silver Porsche 550 Spider, nicknamed Little Bastard, careened off the highway near Kalami, California, killing Hollywood's most promising young star in what appeared to be a tragic accident. For nearly 70 years, the world accepted this narrative. James Dean, the rebellious icon, died as he lived fast, reckless, and young. But in 2023, a deathbed confession from a retired mechanic named Eddie Martinez finally revealed the truth that had been buried beneath decades of studio cover-ups and police corruption. Martinez had been working at Competition Motors, the Porsche dealership where Dean's car had been serviced just days before the fatal crash. In his confession, recorded by his granddaughter as he lay dying of cancer, Martinez revealed that he had been paid $10,000 by unnamed studio executives to sabotage Dean's car. The modification was subtle but deadly, a small device installed in the steering mechanism that would cause the car to veer uncontrollably when activated by radio signal. The revelation solved numerous mysteries that had puzzled investigators for decades. Why had Dean, an experienced and generally careful driver, suddenly lost control on a straight stretch of highway in good weather conditions? Why were there reports of a mysterious black sedan following Dean's car in the hours before the crash? And why had Warner Brothers executives seemed oddly unsurprised by Dean's death, already having contingency plans in place for the promotion of his films? Martinez's confession revealed that Dean had become a liability to the studio system in ways that went far beyond his rebellious on-screen persona. The actor had been secretly documenting the sexual abuse of young male actors by powerful Hollywood executives, including detailed journals and photographs that he planned to turn over to federal investigators. Dean had confided in Martinez during their many conversations about cars and racing, revealing that he had evidence that could bring down half of Hollywood. The mechanic's confession was corroborated by documents found in 2022 during the renovation of a former Warner Brothers executive's mansion. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators discovered a cache of papers including surveillance reports on Dean's activities, transcripts of phone conversations, and most damning of all, receipts showing payments to Martinez and several other individuals for special automotive services. The black sedan that witnesses reported following Dean belonged to private investigators hired by the studio to monitor his movements and ensure he didn't make contact with federal agents before the planned meeting that was scheduled for October 3, 1955, 3 days after his death. The timing was no coincidence. Dean had to be stopped before he could reveal what he knew about the systematic abuse occurring within the Hollywood power structure. Martinez's confession also explained why Dean's friend, Rolf Wutherick, who survived the crash despite being in the passenger seat, had been so adamant that something was wrong with the car's steering in the moments before impact. Wutherick had told investigators that Dean had shouted, "I can't control it," just before the collision, but this testimony had been dismissed as the confused recollections of a severely injured man. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Martinez's revelation was his description of the studio executives who had approached him. They had not seemed surprised or disturbed by what they were asking him to do. Instead, they had treated it as just another business transaction. Another problem to be solved through the studio system's vast network of corruption and influence. The truth about James Dean's death revealed that the young actor hadn't died because of reckless driving or tragic accident. He had been murdered because he had dared to challenge a system of abuse and exploitation that stretched to the highest levels of Hollywood power. His death served as a warning to anyone else who might consider speaking out. In the golden age of Hollywood, rebellion was tolerated only as long as it remained on the screen. How one woman destroyed hundreds of careers during the darkest days of the Hollywood blacklist. When careers were destroyed with whispered accusations and lives were ruined by the mere suspicion of communist sympathies. Everyone knew about the House Un-American Activities Committee and the power of studio executives to end careers with a single phone call. But what they didn't know was that much of the damage was being orchestrated by a single individual working in the shadows, a woman named Dorothy Sullivan, whose name never appeared on any official documents but whose influence reached into every corner of Hollywood. Sullivan worked as a secretary in the offices of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. But her true role was far more sinister. She maintained what she called the book, a detailed registry of every actor, writer, director, and crew member in Hollywood, complete with their political affiliations, personal relationships, sexual preferences, financial difficulties, and any other information that could be used to destroy their careers or force them into compliance with the studio system's demands. The existence of the book was first suspected when patterns began emerging in how blacklist victims were selected. It wasn't random political persecution, it was surgical, targeted destruction based on intimate knowledge of each victim's vulnerabilities. Actors who had attended a single political meeting years earlier found themselves unemployable. Writers, who had never expressed any political opinions publicly, were suddenly branded as communist sympathizers. The precision of the attacks suggested someone with unprecedented access to personal information about Hollywood's elite. In 2020, Sullivan's niece, Margaret Sullivan Reynolds, came forward with a trunk full of documents that had been hidden in her aunt's attic for over 40 years. The trunk contained not only the book itself, over 3,000 pages of meticulously documented personal information, but also correspondence revealing the extent of Sullivan's network of informants and the methods she used to gather intelligence on Hollywood figures. Sullivan had recruited a network of nearly 200 informants throughout Hollywood, maids and butlers who reported on private conversations, telephone operators who recorded calls, restaurant servers who eavesdropped on business meetings, and even prostitutes who gathered compromising information about their clients. She paid them small amounts for information and protected them from prosecution when they broke the law in service of her intelligence gathering operations. The documents reveal that Sullivan didn't limit herself to political persecution. She used her information to manipulate careers, destroy personal relationships, and even cover up crimes committed by those who served her interests. When a prominent director was accused of sexual assault, Sullivan used compromising information about the victim to force her into silence. When a studio executive wanted to break a contract with an expensive star, Sullivan would mysteriously discover communist sympathies in the actor's background. Perhaps most shocking was Sullivan's relationship with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, revealed through personal letters found in the trunk. Hoover had been secretly funding Sullivan's operation through a network of shell companies, using her intelligence network to gather information not just about suspected communists, but about anyone who might oppose the FBI's growing power. Sullivan was essentially running a private intelligence agency within Hollywood, answerable only to Hoover and a small circle of powerful studio executives. The letters revealed that Sullivan took sadistic pleasure in her work, describing in detail how she had orchestrated the destruction of specific careers and boasting about her ability to make or break anyone in this town with a single phone call. In one particularly chilling letter to Hoover, she wrote, "Today, I destroyed 3 careers before lunch and created 2 new stars by dinner time. This is better than playing God, it's being God. Sullivan's operation continued until her death in 1967, but the damage she had caused lasted for decades. Hundreds of talented individuals never worked in Hollywood again. Their careers ended not by official government action but by the whispered rumors and manufactured evidence created by one woman's elaborate intelligence network. The discovery of Sullivan's documents finally solved the mystery of how the blacklist had been so effective and so precisely targeted. It wasn't just political persecution, it was personal destruction as a business model run by someone who understood that in Hollywood, information was more powerful than money, fame, or talent combined. Hollywood's greatest hoax, the actress who fooled America for 3 years. From 1951 to 1954, American audiences fell in love with Rebecca Sterling, a mysterious European actress who appeared in 7 major Hollywood films and was romantically linked to some of the biggest stars of the era. She graced magazine covers, attended premieres, and was hailed as the next Grace Kelly. There was only one problem. Rebecca Sterling never existed. She was an elaborate hoax created by a desperate studio system, and the truth about her identity remained hidden for nearly 70 years. The deception began as a solution to a very real problem facing Paramount Pictures. The studio had invested heavily in a series of romantic dramas specifically designed for their biggest female star. But when she died unexpectedly in a car accident just weeks before filming was scheduled to begin, the studio faced millions of dollars in losses and contractual obligations they couldn't fulfill. Studio head, why? Frank Freeman made a desperate decision. Rather than cancel the productions, Paramount would create a completely fictional actress to fulfill the contracts, using a combination of stand-ins, voice actresses, and elaborate special effects for the era. They constructed Rebecca Sterling. From the ground up, the woman who appeared in the films was actually a composite of 3 different people. The face belonged to Maria Santos, a Portuguese immigrant who worked as a seamstress in Paramount's costume department and bore a striking resemblance to the deceased star. The voice belonged to classically trained actress Eleanor Whitman, who provided all of Sterling's dialogue through post-production dubbing. The body double for more glamorous scenes was a professional dancer named Catherine Moore, who performed under a variety of stage names and was sworn to secrecy about her involvement. The deception was maintained through an elaborate network of studio employees who were either knowingly complicit or carefully deceived about Sterling's true nature. Publicity photos were created using advanced makeup and lighting techniques to make Maria Santos appear more glamorous and European. Interview quotes were written by studio writers and attributed to Sterling, who was said to be too shy to speak directly to the press. The hoax began to unravel in 1954 when Eleanor Whitman, struggling with alcoholism and financial problems, threatened to expose the deception unless she received a larger share of the profits from Sterling's films. Rather than risk exposure, Paramount made the decision to kill off Rebecca Sterling in what they claimed was a tragic accident during a European vacation. The truth about Rebecca Sterling was finally revealed in 2019 when Maria Santos's granddaughter discovered a box of photographs and documents in her grandmother's effects. The box contained not only behind-the-scenes photos showing the elaborate makeup and costume processes used to transform Santos into Sterling, but also contracts and correspondence that detailed the entire deception. The most remarkable aspect of the hoax was how completely it had fooled not just the public, but other Hollywood professionals as well. Several prominent actors who claimed to have had romantic relationships with Sterling were apparently deceived by carefully orchestrated encounters with the various women who portrayed her. One famous leading man had actually been courting Maria Santos while believing he was romancing a glamorous European actress. The Rebecca Sterling hoax revealed the extent to which the studio system was willing to manipulate reality in service of profit. They had created not just a fictional character, but an entire fictional person, complete with a fabricated biography, manufactured relationships, and a carefully constructed public persona that satisfied audience expectations for Hollywood glamour. Perhaps most disturbing was the impact on the 3 women who had been used to create Rebecca Sterling. Maria Santos never acted again and spent the rest of her life working in obscurity, bound by contracts that prevented her from ever revealing her true role in Hollywood history. Eleanor Whitman died in poverty in 1967. Her career destroyed by alcoholism and the psychological toll of living a lie. Catherine Moore disappeared entirely from public records after 1954, and her fate remains unknown. The Rebecca Sterling deception finally solved the mystery of why certain films from the early 1950s had such inconsistent performances from their female leads, and why one of the era's most celebrated actresses had left behind no personal effects, no family members, and no trace of her existence outside of her film appearances. She had never existed because she was never meant to exist. She was simply a product created to serve the studio system's relentless pursuit of profit. The Ed Sullivan Show, more than entertainment, every Sunday night for 23 years. families across America gathered around their television sets to watch The Ed Sullivan Show, trusting that the awkward host with the unusual mannerisms was bringing them wholesome entertainment. What they didn't know was that Sullivan's show was being used as a testing ground for psychological experiments designed to influence public opinion and behavior on a massive scale. The truth about Sullivan's show began to emerge in 2018 when Dr. Patricia Morrison, a retired psychologist from Stanford University, came forward with documents that had been given to her by her mentor, Dr. Frederick Williams. Before his death in 1995, Williams had been part of a secret CIA program that used popular television shows to test the effectiveness of subliminal messaging and behavioral conditioning on large populations. The documents reveal that beginning in 1955, The Ed Sullivan Show became a laboratory for studying mass psychological manipulation. The CIA, working through a front organization called the Institute for Communications Research, had approached Sullivan with an offer he couldn't refuse: substantial payments in exchange for allowing scientific consultants to provide input on the show's content and presentation. The experiments were subtle but sophisticated. Specific colors were used in set designs to trigger emotional responses. Musical performances were arranged to test the effectiveness of certain rhythms and frequencies in influencing mood and behavior. Even Sullivan's famous awkward introductions were carefully scripted to include subliminal suggestions that would be absorbed by viewers without their conscious awareness. Dr. Morrison's documents include detailed analysis of audience reactions to various experiments conducted during the show's broadcasts. One particularly disturbing study measured the effectiveness of using children's performances to reduce resistance to authority figures, while another tested whether specific camera angles and lighting techniques could increase consumer spending. Among viewers, the most significant experiment took place on February 9, 1964, during the Beatles' first appearance on the show. While America believed they were witnessing a cultural phenomenon, they were actually participating in the largest psychological experiment ever conducted on the American public. The screaming, fainting, and mass hysteria that characterized Beatles weren't entirely spontaneous. They had been engineered through a careful combination of subliminal audio frequencies, strategic camera work, and planted audience members trained to trigger specific responses. The documents reveal that the CIA was studying whether intense emotional experiences shared by large groups could be used to make populations more susceptible to political messaging. The Beatles experiment was so successful that similar techniques were later used during political broadcasts and major news events throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Sullivan himself was apparently unaware of the full extent of the experiments being conducted through his show. He believed he was simply working with television research consultants who were helping to improve the show's effectiveness and audience appeal. The payments he received were disguised as consulting fees and production bonuses, making the arrangement appear to be standard television industry practice. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the television broadcasts themselves. The Institute for Communications Research had developed techniques for using the anticipation and discussion surrounding popular television shows to influence social behavior. They studied how families talked about the show during the week, how children incorporated elements from performances into their play, and how the shared cultural experience of watching Sullivan's show could be used to spread specific ideas and attitudes throughout American society. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation in Dr. Morrison's documents was the success rate of these experiments. By 1967, the Institute had developed techniques that could reliably influence the behavior and opinions of up to 40% of the show's audience on any given topic. They had essentially weaponized entertainment, turning one of America's most beloved television programs into a tool for mass mind control. The truth about The Ed Sullivan Show finally explained why the program had such an unusual power to create cultural phenomena, why certain performances seemed to have effects far beyond their artistic merit, and why Sullivan himself often seemed surprised by the intensity of audience reactions to his guests. He hadn't just been hosting a variety show, he had been conducting the largest psychological experiment in human history, and most of America had been willing participants without ever knowing they were being studied. The Exorcist. When fiction became too real. When William Peter Blatty began writing The Exorcist in 1969, he thought he was crafting a work of supernatural fiction based on a real exorcism case from the 1940s. What he didn't know was that his research had led him to document a genuine supernatural phenomenon, and that the very act of writing about it would unleash a series of events that would terrorize everyone involved in bringing the story to the screen. The Curse of the Exorcist began before filming even started. 9 people connected to the production died during or immediately after the movie was completed, including actors, crew members, and even some of their family members. A fire of mysterious origin destroyed most of the film sets, delaying production for 6 weeks. Strange accidents, unexplained illnesses, and bizarre supernatural phenomena plagued the production from beginning to end. But the true extent of the curse wasn't understood until 2016, when Father Thomas McDermott, a Catholic priest who had served as a consultant on the film, finally broke his silence about what had really happened during production. Before his death in 2017, Father McDermott recorded a detailed confession that revealed the terrifying truth behind the film's supernatural occurrences. According to Father McDermott, the problems began when Blatty's research led him to the actual case files from the 1940s exorcism that had inspired his novel. The files contained not just accounts of the possession, but actual artifacts from the case, including transcripts of the demon's voice, photographs of supernatural phenomena, and most dangerous of all, the actual words of the Latin incantations that had been used during the exorcism. When Blatty incorporated these authentic elements into his screenplay, he unknowingly created what Father McDermott called a modern grimoire, a book of spells and supernatural instructions that had real power to summon the same demonic forces that had been involved in the original case. The priest's confession revealed that the deaths and accidents that plagued the production weren't coincidences, they were deliberate attacks by supernatural entities that had been awakened by the film's creation. He described witnessing levitation, telepathic communication, and other phenomena that convinced him that the film set had become a battleground between good and evil forces. Most disturbing were Father McDermott's accounts of what happened to the actors who portrayed the possessed characters. Ellen Burstyn, who played the mother, began experiencing what she described as intrusive thoughts that weren't her own. Linda Blair, who played the possessed child, reportedly began speaking in languages she had never learned and demonstrated knowledge of events she had no way of knowing about. The priest's confession also revealed that director William Friedkin had been secretly consulting with multiple religious authorities throughout production, seeking protection and guidance as the supernatural phenomena escalated. Several Catholic priests, Jewish rabbis, and experts in other religious traditions had been called in to perform protective rituals and blessings, but their efforts seemed only to anger the supernatural forces involved. The most chilling aspect of Father McDermott's account was his description of what he called the spreading curse. He claimed that the supernatural influence didn't end with the completion of filming, but continued to affect people who worked on the film's distribution and exhibition. Theater owners reported unusual accidents and disturbances. Critics who wrote negative reviews experienced personal tragedies. Even audiences weren't immune. The priest documented dozens of cases of people who claimed to have experienced supernatural phenomena after watching the film. Father McDermott's confession finally explained why The Exorcist had such an unprecedented psychological impact on audiences. When it was released in 1973, it wasn't just the power of cinema. It was the result of genuine supernatural forces that had been awakened by the film's creation and were continuing to exert their influence on everyone who encountered the story. The priest's final words in his confession were a warning. Some stories are too dangerous to tell, and some truths are too powerful to put on screen. We didn't make a movie about the supernatural. We created a supernatural phenomenon, and it's still out there, still affecting people, still growing stronger every time someone watches it. The Curse of the Exorcist finally solved the mystery of why the film had such lasting power to disturb and influence people, why it continued to generate reports of supernatural phenomena decades after its release, and why so many people involved in its creation had been reluctant to discuss their experiences. They hadn't just made a horror movie, they had opened a doorway to something far more terrifying than fiction. The Fourth Network, television's greatest cover-up in the early days of television, Americans believed they had three major networks competing for their attention: NBC, CBS, and ABC. But hidden documents discovered in 2020 reveal that there was actually a fourth network operating in secret. From 1952 to 1967, broadcasting experimental programming designed to test the limits of what television could do to human consciousness and behavior. The network called itself Continental Broadcasting System, and it operated through a sophisticated network of low-power transmitters that could override local television signals for brief periods, without being detected by viewers or authorities. The network's existence was first suspected by television repair technicians who began noticing unusual signal patterns in programming that didn't match any known broadcast schedules. The truth about Continental Broadcasting came to light when electronics engineer Robert Chen was cleaning out his late father's workshop and discovered a collection of technical manuals and circuit diagrams for experimental television transmission equipment dating from the 1950s and 1960s. Chen's father, Dr. Paul Chen, had been a television engineer who worked on classified government projects during the early days of the medium. The documents revealed that Continental Broadcasting was a joint operation between the CIA, major television manufacturers, and a consortium of research universities. Their goal was to study the effects of television programming on human behavior, consciousness, and social attitudes by broadcasting experimental content to unsuspecting audiences and measuring their responses.